Okay.
Wait a minute, we need the DNA test. Get the swab
Is this the
out.
real Gary Sessums?
Swab personal areas.
Okay, this is the AMRAD February 2018 meeting, and we're getting a presentation today on the, do we call it the Force of 50? Puerto Rico.
Yeah, the video. It's somewhat centered.
And that part of the video, the simulated roller coaster.
That's what hurricane winds will do that to.
Yeah.
It's at a 45-degree angle like the rest of the towers.
And I'll let our presenter introduce himself, and I guess we're going to try and make a video of this. We can share around.
All right, well,
take it.
thank you for inviting me. My name is Gary Sessums, KC5QCN. The presentation today will be about the American Radio Relay League and American Red Cross Force of 50 that deployed down to the territory of Puerto Rico back in September of 2017 in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Next slide, we're having a little technical difficulty. We're not doing a PowerPoint. We're displaying this from a PDF file, so it's more of a scrolling effect than a page down effect. This sort of gives the timeline for Hurricane Maria deployment. Wednesday, September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico as a Category 4 storm. After that, the American Red Cross had people on scene along with the state emergency management people, the territory emergency management people, surveying the damage. They realized that Puerto Rico got whacked pretty hard with Hurricane Maria. The American Radio Relay League and the American Red Cross have had an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding between each other for many, many years, but they've never executed it. So based on the SITREPs, the situation reports coming out of Puerto Rico and the on-scene damage assessment, the American Red Cross decided to execute that Memorandum of Understanding with the American Radio Relay League. So the ARRL put out a call for amateur radio operators to be able to deploy to the island of Puerto Rico to support the American Red Cross. So the ARRL was recruiting hams with the technical knowledge and the ability to travel on short notice, but that was the role of the ARRL, was to recruit and deploy, and you would be working under the auspices of the American Red Cross. So the word went out. They had about 350 hams reply to the ARRL's call for action, and out of that 350, they selected 50, and that's where the Force of 50 moniker has come about. But out of that 50 that they selected, they only deployed 22 of us. So really, it's the ARRL and American Red Cross Force of 22. So all across the United States, everybody had replied to the publicized ARRL notice and recruitment for hams. It went out with a nationwide email blast. It was on the ARRL website. It was a lot of amateur club nets. It got sent out on the repeaters on club nets. So they had a good response of about 350 hams. So the ARRL selected the people to deploy, and on Tuesday, September 26th, the American Red Cross cut orders for those 22 hams to deploy, and we were from all over the United States. So from northwest, southeast, central United States, everybody had a plane ticket purchased for them by the Red Cross to fly to Atlanta, Georgia, to a staging area. So we all arrived in Atlanta, went to a hotel right off site of the airport to the staging area, and the ARRL had these ham aid kits. They're basically Pelican cases with radio equipment in them. A lot of your donations to the ARRL have gone to pay for these kits. They've been used over the years since they were introduced in various emergencies and deployments. And for this particular one, a lot of the commercial vendors kicked in some extra money to build up some kits. So we got to Atlanta, we had our Pelican cases with the hamr kits. We kind of went through them, made sure we had all the connectors and bells and whistles and this, that, and the other. And then on Wednesday, actually on Thursday, September 28th, we departed on a chartered JetBlue flight from Atlanta down to San Juan, Puerto Rico. So we had landed in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Power was partially at the airport, so they had enough power for the control tower and the radios and everything to be able to land and take off planes, but the passenger terminal had no electricity. So when we landed, there was no air conditioning, no power. You're kind of walking there, you know, in the hot, sweaty, boxed-in area. You know, there's no conveyor belt bringing your bags out. They come out on a cart and you sort of pick up your bags. So out of the 22 hams that deployed to Puerto Rico under the auspices of the Red Cross recruited by the ARRL, the oldest ham was 75 years old, born in 1942, and the youngest ham was age 19, born in 1998. And there was a mixture of experience. Some were extra class hams, but they were, how should we say, book knowledge and no experience to go along with it. Others had been, you know, ham for many, many years, been to many deployments, had a lot of MacGyver and jury rigging experience under their belt. So it was a mixture of A to Z hams and their knowledge and experience. It was supposed to be a 3-week deployment under the auspices of the American Red Cross, but the last ham, yours truly, was unable to get off the island until October 23rd. So I spent a total of 27 days on the island of Puerto Rico, and mainly I couldn't get a flight out. When our gig was up, you had to get with the Red Cross travel person and book a flight out, and there were no flights to be had. So I had to spend an extra week there. So go ahead and scroll to the next slide. So here's a picture of Puerto Rico, kind of give you an idea of the geography. It's 100 miles wide, about 40 miles in width, and it's interesting how they do the government there. It's 78 municipalities headed by a mayor, so it's not really like a county or a town. It's just more of a geographical municipality and a mayor, and he controls everything from the fire department to the police department or whatever. Let's scroll up to the next slide. Sort of shows you the track of Hurricane Maria. Sort of went southeast to northwest across the island. And here's the state capital of San Juan, the Arecibo Observatory, some of the different municipalities here. But as a Category 4 storm, they got whacked pretty hard. The infrastructure of Puerto Rico, the electrical power grid, and some of the communications infrastructure was not in that great a shape before the storm hit. And with the whacking that they took from Hurricane Maria, they were in bad shape. Go ahead and scroll to the next one. So our original amateur radio mission, so, you know, everybody says it was the ARRL Force of 50, but you got to realize the ARRL was just recruiting the hams on behalf of the Red Cross under the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding. So we were actually under the control of the American Red Cross. ARRL recruited, turned us over to the Red Cross, and we're there to support the Red Cross. So the original mission was to support the Red Cross operations by doing health and welfare radio traffic using WinLink HF radio. You could get information from the island out to the mainland to report to family and loved ones on the status of an individual in Puerto Rico. But it's just near impossible to take inquiries from the U.S. mainland to try to locate Uncle Joe or Aunt Mary or whoever on the island. It's just too hard to do. Everybody's scattered, and it's just basically undoable. So we were going to support the Red Cross with health and welfare traffic and support their local Red Cross operations on the island of Puerto Rico with family reunification efforts. Once we got there and realized the magnitude of the damage and what needed to be done and the skill level of the force of 22, we had a lot of MacGyvers and jury riggers. So we sort of had our amateur radio hat on at one time. We'd take it off and put on our electrical repair hat, take it off, put on our plumbing hat, or whatever kind of general skill set you had. And there was, in our deployment team, we had a very good skill set. So we did a lot of jury rigging and MacGyverism to sort of help out where we could. We did so much more than amateur radio. So go ahead and slide to the next thing. So here are the areas that we supported after the mission assignment got changed from the original mission to a much broader support of A to Z type communications. These are some of the areas that we supported. So we had hams, of our 22 hams, we were supporting the Red Cross at Red Cross headquarters. Their building had gotten damaged. The Telemundo network, Spanish language radio and broadcast network, offered the Red Cross space in one of their buildings. So we went to the Red Cross headquarters at Telemundo, and we established amateur radio operations. We had to string coax up on the roof, put antennas up on the roof, and set all of our equipment up. Also, they wanted a liaison, amateur radio liaison to the ESF2, Emergency Support Function number 2, which is communications, over at the FEMA and PREMA EOC. PREMA is the Puerto Rico Emergency Management Agency. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So we had hams at the FEMA PREMA EOC. We had hams at the Red Cross headquarters. We sent out hams to the Puerto Rico fire departments, and in the Spanish language they call them bomberos. So we went as many hams as we could to the different bomberos. The various hospitals that were operating, we sent out hams to provide communications. The Guacataca Dam was in danger of collapsing. So we sent out a ham out there to relay information to the dam authority and back to the EOC about the status of the dam. So the engineers were on site at the dam, they were checking stuff, and we were relaying that information via amateur radio. We had hams assisting out at the Arecibo Air Observatory. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, they were trying to restore power. It's interesting when we got there, no infrastructure is working, no cell phone service, no radio, no television, no 911, no public safety communication. Any kind of communications was simplex, that was it. The Red Cross was trying to operate their distribution centers and do their family reunification efforts, and the amateur radio operators were assisting with those operations. So go ahead and scroll up to the next one. So here's yours truly. I got assigned to be the amateur radio liaison at the FEMA EOC, the governor's EOC at the Puerto Rico Convention Center. So the Puerto Rico Convention Center served as the Puerto Rico Governor's Command Center, the PREMA and FEMA EOC. It was the focal point for all of the relief efforts in San Juan, really island-wide, but that's where the EOC was. And we tried to assist with amateur radio communications island-wide via HF radio to funnel all that information. We need food and water down here in Ponce or over at Aguadilla or whatever part of the island we were on. We were relaying that information via HF radio and amateur bands back from around the island to the EOC. Scroll down to the next one, please. So here's a picture of the FEMA EOC. It was at the Puerto Rico Convention Center, a relatively nice building in San Juan. It's built very strongly to survive storms of this kind, and all it had been used in the past was for tourists, the governor's inaugural ball, different high society events and stuff. But if you go to the next slide, this is the inside of FEMA EOC inside the Puerto Rico Convention Center. Basically, on the third floor was the FEMA EOC, the second floor was the PREMA EOC, and then the first floor was where everybody was going to sign up for relief aid, the citizens of Puerto Rico. And it got pretty crowded in here, and if you're familiar with emergency response, each of these tables represented a different emergency support function at ESF. So ESF 1 is transportation, ESF 2 is communications, ESF 8 is medical, ESF 6 is mass care, Red Cross. So every response function had a different table in there. And we had to set up amateur radio and HF communications here in the Puerto Rico Convention Center. So we had to string, just like we did at Telemundo, we had to string coax from the roof inside, set up radios. Next slide, please. This is up on the roof of the Convention Center. We put up VHF and HF communications, ran the coax down inside the doors and set up radios inside. Next slide, please. I did make the issue, the December issue of QST magazine, if y'all got to read that. Not doing anything special other than tying off the end of a wire dipole antenna, but I got my 15 minutes of fame and QST, you know, it's in libraries all across the United States. I have my picture there. So we had, like I say, the earlier picture was a VHF vertical antenna. We had HF wire antennas. The rooftop of the EOC got very congested very quickly with all the different agencies coming in and setting up communications. Next slide. This is Oscar Resto, KP4RF. He's the Puerto Rico section manager, and he got impacted. He is in real life, he is a college professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and he works with NASA and doing satellites and teaching the students about space and satellites. But the University of Puerto Rico was closed. All the high schools, elementary schools were closed, no power. And Oscar got whacked pretty hard himself. He had no power at his house. So he can't go to work. He can't do anything to his house. So he put on his ARRL section manager hat and played amateur radio full time. So when we got there, we liaised with the Puerto Rico section manager, the ARRL, and here's a picture of myself and Oscar up on the roof stringing some antennas and coax. Now, these are in the UHF spectrum. These were for talking to the helicopters. The helicopters were doing recon missions around the island, shooting video and streaming that video back to the EOC. Wait a minute, this is not amateur radio. Like I said earlier, we're taking off our amateur radio hat, putting on our MacGyver hat, and helping out wherever we could. So even though this is not amateur radio antennas, these are military antennas and commercial antennas going to communications, air-to-ground communications on UHF spectrum to shoot video back to the EOC. Next slide, please. So here are some of the radios out of the Go kits that we set up. These are ICOM 7200s, MFJ power supply, tuners. So here's myself and Valerie. We were the amateur radio liaisons at the EOC. Here's just a shot of us at the EOC operating the radios, talking around the island. Next slide, please. This is another map of Puerto Rico. All of the little sticky notes on the map indicate where we had amateur radio operators around the island of Puerto Rico. They have two little smaller islands, Vieques and Culebra. And we also had amateur radio operators there. So we were doing amateur radio, we did Mars operations, we did shares, HF radio operations, any kind of RF that we could communicate, we were doing from A to Z. So it was so much more than amateur radio. Next slide, please. Every day at 0900, they had the meeting of the ESF2 Communications Task Force, and that was headed by a FEMA representative. So anybody and everybody on the island that had anything to do with communications would meet, and we would discuss about how we're going to restore communications. So amateur radio, I was the amateur radio liaison to the ESF2 Communications Task Force, and we would meet every morning and give a report on what we're doing to restore communications. So the FCC was there, the NTIA was there, the Puerto Rico State Police, all the federal agencies, U.S. Secret Service, Immigration, Border Patrol, people that had federal radio on the island were there. All of the commercial broadcasters, television and radio and TV, a lot of them were affected, some of them were off the air. The FCC was trying to encourage the commercial broadcasters to get back on the air as soon as possible because of the emergency broadcast system. If they had another warning they wanted to get out to the general public, a lot of the radio stations, their tower was down or their studio was flooded or beyond operational capability, or their studio to transmitter link was down. So we had all kind of assets trying to help get the Puerto Rico State Police back up and operational. They were on 800 megahertz. Of course, the broadcasters are in their normal broadcast bands, but they needed help with getting their facilities restored. And the FCC was pressing them to get back on the air so they could have the emergency broadcast system. Next slide, please. So one of the things we would do every morning from an amateur radio perspective is we would produce this ARRL, American Red Cross situation report of what we had done the previous 24 hours. So every agency that was represented on the ESF2 Communications Task Force would give a daily briefing. Valerie, who was featured in some of the earlier pictures, she would produce this report every morning on behalf of all the amateur radio operators, and we put our bullet points about what we had done to help restore communication. So this is just a sample of one day's sit rep that we turned in to FEMA every morning. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier about the ESF, emergency support functions. So here's a list of the different ESFs and what they represent. And again, if you're responding to a disaster, you need to know where you're gonna fit in the overall big picture. So if you get a chance to take any of the FEMA courses that help you understand if you're gonna be a responder, they teach you where you fit in the overall big picture. But if you're gonna be, you don't show up and say, I'm an amateur radio operator, I'm here to help. You say, I'm part of ESF2 Communications, and they know what you're talking about. They can say, go over here and talk to the ESF2 representative, and he will assign you a task. So anyway, we're part of ESF2, and amateur radio, public safety communications, broadcasters, carrier pigeons, smoke signals, anything to do with communications falls under ESF2. Next slide, please. So then we get to ESF 13, which is the military. And they're all there, and we're talking across the island on HF, simplex, unencrypted, and they're trying to do frequency hopping, spread spectrum, and green radios with encryption, and they can't talk to each other. And we're talking island-wide, and they're like, what the heck is this? So we're trying to explain to the military what the heck is amateur radio. So you got all these green suits, military people, and we're just talking away, and they're like, well, I can't get this to work, and blah, blah, blah. So we had to show them, you know, what amateur radio is and what we could do and how we were operating. Next slide. So here's just another picture. This is the roof of the Puerto Rico Convention Center. You see in the background, we had some VHF antennas erected. Again, we're on the roof explaining to them what amateur radio is and what amateur radio does. Next slide, please. Again, inside, different green suiters, they kept coming over to our little operations area, and we would explain to them what amateur radio is and what spectrum we operated in. Of course, the military and the federal government all operate under NTIA rules and regulations, whereas we as amateur radio and the broadcasters operate under FCC rules and regulations. So we had to tell them, you know, this is our little chunk of the spectrum, and here's where we operate, and you're over here. Now we can talk to each other on these 60 megahertz, these 5 megahertz frequencies, you know, 60 meter band. So we had to explain to them that if they took one of their green radios and dropped it out of frequency hopping spread spectrum, turned off the encryption, that we could actually talk to each other. And they're like, wow, didn't know you could do that. You know, so we had to explain to them a lot about how we operated and what we did. Next slide, please. Out at Fort Buchanan, they have the U.S. Army garrison at Fort Buchanan. They have a command center, EOC out there. And of course, the military has gone to mostly satellite operations. And they do have HF, and on the roof, they got whacked just like the rest of the island. If you go to the next slide, here's a rooftop shot of the Fort Buchanan EOC. They got whacked, and you'll see these are non-penetrating roof mounts with bricks for ballast to hold the upright skids to run antennas on the roof. And they had an HF B&W Barker and Williamson folded dipole up there that got destroyed during the storm. They had a replacement, a spare in a box, but they didn't have the manpower that knew how to install it. So they asked us, the amateur radio operators, to help them put it up. We didn't help them, we actually put it up because they didn't know how to do it. But anyway, we got the 80 meter dipole set back up on the roof and got them back in operation. Next slide. So next couple shots will be over at the, first couple shots were over at the EOC where I worked. Next couple shots will be at the American Red Cross Puerto Rico headquarters, which was at Telemundo. So next slide. Here's a shot of the amateur radio operators running net control for amateur radio nets around the island. You can see some of the names of the call signs of the amateurs, and this is the force of 22 that deployed down there. This gentleman was a local Puerto Rico ham. The local Puerto Rican ham community was devastated. They lost a lot of their equipment, their homes damaged in the storm. But as soon as they were able to get back on the air with car batteries or a generator or whatever. So when we arrived, there were some repeaters that were back on the air, and that they had nets in progress in Spanish. We would come up on the air in English, and they would immediately flip to speaking English, and we would talk to them. So at the Red Cross, we maintained a net control for the island of various repeaters and on HF radio. Next slide, please. Just an exterior shot of the Telemundo building in San Juan, and they had donated space to the American Red Cross because the original Red Cross facility was damaged. Next slide. Just like we did at the EOC, we had some of our amateur radio operators. Here's a picture of Andy climbing a tower, stringing coax up the tower, and running dipole antennas off the tower up on the top of the Telemundo building. Next slide. Again, more shots. Here's Oscar, the Puerto Rico section manager. Andy in the far right, he was the one you saw in the previous picture, hanging the antenna. Matt there. We ran 24/7 net control operations out of the American Red Cross location there. Next slide. Again, some different shots of the amateur radio operations that we set up. So when we got there, none of this existed. So we set up all these amateur radio equipment and began operations, ran the coaxes up to the roof and began operations. Next slide. These were the ARRL Go kits, the ham 8 kits that we referred to earlier. These were made available by your donations to the ARRL and by corporate donations to the ARRL. And again, they contain the ICOM 7200s, power supplies, tuners, antennas, and cables to make it all work. We did have laptop computers that the Red Cross donated, and we loaded the WinLink 2000 software on it. So we were running WinLink. We originally had set up WinLink to go back to the United States. That was sort of hit or miss based on propagation. Lessons learned, set up a WinLink gateway on the island for intra-island WinLink operations rather than trying to go back and hit a WinLink node in the United States. Next slide, please. Net control every morning would update the whiteboard on the different cities. So here you can see Laris, Ponce, Cuba Libre, Yaco, Vieques, the dam, Huacataca Dam, Aguadilla. I'm murdering the name of the cities here, but you can see that every day, and Valerie and I were over at the EOC, but you can see every day net control where we deployed a ham. At the beginning, the hams were day trips. They would get up early in the morning, deploy to Aguadilla, spend the day, and come back. Later on, during our deployment, they would spend the night out there. The Puerto Rico Fire Department, the Bomberos, they offered us safe haven and refuge at the fire department. So if you were out on a day trip and you were unable to get back due to weather or nightfall, you could seek refuge at any of the fire departments. They would put you up, give you a cot, feed you, give you water. May not be able to speak to you in English, but at least they knew that you may show up and they would take care of you until the next morning. So every day the net control would update the whiteboard with the status of the hams and where they are and what their operation was. Next slide. FEMA, coming into San Juan, I deployed down to Mississippi back in 2005 for Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina was a big disaster also, but you could get aid in by having relief efforts and 18-wheel tractor trailer rigs drive in from adjacent states to bring in outside aid. Puerto Rico, out in the middle of the ocean. The only way to get there was by barge or by airport. FEMA Airways and the U.S. Military Airlift Command, they were running nonstop flights in. They brought in these FEMA MERS. These are communications vehicles that communicate A to Z, and the cache of equipment and supplies go with it. So we get down there and we're trying to help people put stuff back together, amateur radio, and of course everything we have is PL259 connectors, UHF connectors. Military uses N connectors. Two don't talk to each other without a little adapter. Our buddies at FEMA, they've got N to PL259, N connectors to UHF connectors, and we were able to get a lot of equipment, some coax for stringing antennas, various adapters and connectors from FEMA, and they were a big benefit to everybody, not only amateur radio, but all of the other agencies down in Puerto Rico that needed communication support. Disparate communications, the Puerto Rico State Police were on 800 megahertz trunk system. When the trunk system goes down, they revert to standalone, get out of the talk groups and get
Site trunking mode.
Yeah, and of course, there's always issues with that. So the guy that programmed all the car radios, if you're in this car and your channel 1 is this in simplex, well, over you're in car 2, his channel 1 is not the same as your channel 1. So there was a lot of experimenting to try to figure out channel 1 in this car talks to channel 7 in this car to be on the same frequency because some guy didn't program it correctly in the beginning. So we found a lot of that stuff going on. All the fire departments were on VHF simplex without repeaters around the island. Of course, their big tower, all the towers were down. They were unable to communicate. The hospitals were on UHF, the med system UHF. So you had 800 megahertz, UHF, VHF, all kind of different communications. Next slide, please. When we did deploy the hams around the island, this is one of the deployed ARRL ham aid kits. So you can see the ICOM 7200, the laptop running the WinLink software, the power supply, the tuner, and here you see the coax going outside. So this is in a fire department, a bomberos station. Some of them had power, others didn't. But all the fire departments, anywhere we operated, everything was off generator power. Next slide. So it's kind of hard to see with this little, what do you call this, enhanced feature, your little, you're about to have this display in this feature here. But anyway, these are nice free-range chickens. Next slide. You see our free-range chickens in a different format. So it was definitely a different experience down there. I ate so much rice and beans in Puerto Rico. If you got to eat the chickens here on the gas grill, it was nice because I got tired of rice and beans every day. Next slide, please. This is some of our MacGyver jury rigging. This is a flagpole at one of the fire departments, and you can see the improvised lumber and dual band VHF, UHF antenna running up the side of the flagpole there. Yeah. Next slide, please. Personal hygiene. No water. What do? Well, you got a 5-gallon bucket, and you do the old sponge up and try to rinse off. So in the shower, so this is a restroom, but has no running water. And where you can get water, you can bathe out of a bucket. The toilets, no running water to flush them, But you know, you can take the lid off the toilet, take the 5-gallon bucket, fill up the toilet tank, and you get one flush out of it. So if you wanted to bathe, you bathed out of a 5-gallon bucket. If you wanted to flush the toilet, you took the 5-gallon bucket and filled up the toilet tank to be able to flush it. Next slide. Laundry. You're out there sweating. Puerto Rico, tropical paradise. It's like 75, 80 degrees. You're sweating like a stuck pig out there. Clothes get mighty stinky. You gotta do laundry. Where are you gonna do your laundry? In the 5-gallon bucket. When you get through doing your laundry, next slide, you're gonna hang them out on a clothesline because there's no dryer to dry your clothes. So this is out back of one of the bomberos, and you see the water buffaloes. So most of the communities, the National Guard and the military had brought in water buffaloes to bring water out to the outlying communities because the water supply was not functioning. You had no electricity to pump the water. Next slide. El Gato, or as I call them, damn cats. Here is a damn cat convention. The pets, wildlife, horses, cows, pigs, free range running everywhere. A lot of the fences were down because of the hurricane damage. These particular cats just, you know, they decided to have a cat convention and they're hanging around, but you're like, wow, I've never seen so many cats in one place at one time. So this was the El Gato convention. Next slide. They had this saying, this was taken down in the town of Lares, and I can't pronounce it, but anyway, it means Lares rising in this picture, and then other parts of the island, you would see Puerto Rico rises. But that was their slogan that, you know, we will overcome, we will recover from Hurricane Maria. Next slide, please. Our accommodations, when we first got to Puerto Rico, we slept on, we were housed in a church. The church donated space for the Red Cross to house their volunteers. And so the first couple nights we were sleeping on the floor in church benches and cots. Later on, when I started serving as the ESF2 liaison at the EOC, I got upgraded to the FEMA Hilton. And the FEMA Hilton is the big open bunk room, and this was co-ed. So you had all kind of federal responders, state responders from around the United States. You would probably spend 1 or 2 nights, 3 nights here in the FEMA Hilton in the ground floor of the Puerto Rico Convention Center before being deployed elsewhere in the island to your destination. So anyway, most disasters on the cots, they call it the FEMA Hilton. Next slide. This was a church locally. We had slept on the pews. You see the Red Cross blankets there. And realize that this is 75, 80 degrees most of the day and night. First night, I think we had electricity, but after that, we lost power. So you're trying to sleep in pitch black, dark, and no air conditioning, and all these people and their big snoring going on. Man, I needed earplugs. So a lot of snorers down there. Next slide, please. You probably heard a lot about politicians on the U.S. broadcast networks complaining about the United States government not providing aid to the island of Puerto Rico. I call BS. I was there. This is a shot from air cargo at the San Juan Airport. There was all kind of relief aid from the federal government and U.S. relief agencies, international relief agencies, flowing into Puerto Rico. They did have a problem getting it from air cargo distributed around the island, but that was due to the distribution system and road closures and bridges out and this, that, and the other. But despite the politicians trying to score political points on television, outside aid was making it to the island of Puerto Rico. Next slide. We did have a visit from President Trump. He did not make it over to the EOC. He landed at a military base in Puerto Rico, went out and visited with the local Puerto Ricans and did his tour of the island. Next slide. Did have Mike Pence, the Vice President, come there. And you see this hand. I haven't washed this hand since last September. This is the hand that shook hands with Vice President Mike Pence. This was taken inside the Puerto Rico Convention Center. Vice President came in, made his speech, and as he's heading out, He's sort of working the rope line, shaking hands as the Secret Service is escorting him out. I'm at the very end. I got to shake hands with the Vice President. I haven't washed my hands yet, so anyway, next slide. We did have the U.S. House Speaker, Paul Ryan, come to visit. He spoke to us in the convention center. Next slide. And of course, the governor of Puerto Rico was there full time. That was his EOC. So the governor spent time there at the EOC. He had his state employees briefing him about the situation around the island and what recovery efforts were coming in and what needed to be done. The FEMA people were taking all that situation and feeding it back to DC, to higher ups, and that would get up to the president and others. Next slide. All along the roadsides, everywhere, there were a lot of support from the local Puerto Rican people. This was a sign that a couple of ladies had painted up themselves, and they were thanking the first responders, all of the volunteers that had come to Puerto Rico to help them out. So I had to squeeze in there to get my picture made by their little homemade sign. Next slide. This is Oscar Resto, the Puerto Rican section manager. Here's a group of us, the force of 50, actually the force of 22. And Oscar's sort of talking to us about the next day's mission. Next slide. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here and show you some of the damage around the island. I have to swap because these are way too big a slide to fit in that PowerPoint. So this is one of the ospreys, and he's got a big, hard to see with this little emblem there, but these are these concrete barriers you see along the interstate that they block off lanes with. So this Osprey, a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, next slide. Let's see if we can show it. It may not be to further down. Yeah, it's going to be further down. But anyway, the Guacataca Dam was breached, and they were using that Osprey to lower these concrete barriers to try to plug up where the leak was. So these are not any particular order. We'll zip through these. Just a street shot, and this may be Aguadilla, maybe Lares, I can't remember. But these are just photos from around the island as we go out and do these day trips and try to provide relief effort. This may be a family reunification effort. Our guys are snapping pictures, and you see people are bringing out their water-soaked mattresses. You see some of the power infrastructure is collapsed over here. Next slide. This was, a lot of the hospitals were non-functioning. Here in the United States, we have a U.S. Department of Public Health function called DMAT, Disaster Medical Assistance Team, basically a MASH unit. So every DMAT in the United States was deployed down to Puerto Rico, and this is a field hospital set up in the parking lot of a regular brick and mortar hospital in Puerto Rico, because the brick and mortar hospital has been flooded, has mud, water all in the hospital, has no power, no air conditioning. So in the parking lot, they set up these field hospitals to treat the wounded. Next slide. So here's a brick and mortar hospital that's non-operational. In the previous picture, you saw the field hospital in the parking lot of the hospital. Next slide. Some of these are aerial shots and drone shots of just the damage around the island. We'll kind of flip through these pretty quick. Next slide. Again, aerial shots from around the island showing the damage. Next slide. Yeah, just more damage. You see the roof missing, Next slide. Yeah, roof missing. This was near the Guacataca Dam. You see the water flow. Next slide. More roofs missing. More roofs missing. Erosion, landslides. A lot of these houses, you had two kind of houses there. You had the wood structures. Most of the wood frame houses were demolished. These were brick houses. It's interesting the people of Puerto Rico and how they do things. You buy a piece of land, and you had to scrape and save up all your nickels and dimes to buy the land. And then a couple of years later, you may have enough money to start building a house. So you pour a slab, and you may have some columns going up with rebar in it, and then you're out of money. And so you drive by, it's a nice piece of land, you got a slab, you got vertical columns, brick, poured concrete, and rebar poking out. And it made me another couple of years where they can scrounge up enough money to, they build the houses in stages depending on the income of the Puerto Rican building the house. But most of the houses in this part of the island were built out of poured concrete and reinforced rebar. So they survived the storm, but you see they're affected by the erosion. Next slide. And just more pictures, next slide. So most of these are pretty much the same, just showing you the damage. Next slide. Next slide. You see the flooding and some of the erosion damage. Next slide. Next slide. You can see the bridge and everything is gone that was here. Next slide. This was a shopping center outside of, I think this was Larry's. Next slide. You can see the flooding. Next slide. Piece of the roadway washed away, laying there. Next slide. So you can see that they got hit pretty hard. Next slide. Look at us. Now here, you're heading out to go to a town. I'm old-fashioned. I took my little Garmin GPS that plugs into the cigarette lighter and sits on my dashboard, and it gets satellite signal, draws me a map of where I'm going. I can type in the address and it will take me there. That's old-fashioned. Everybody now has their smartphone, and they get the app that gets the cell phone signals to show them where to go. There is no cell phone service in Puerto Rico. There's nothing working down there. So you're trying to navigate with your smartphone. I got nothing. So note to self, if you're going to deploy to a hurricane damaged area, do not rely on your smartphone and the apps to help you navigate. Get the old-fashioned GPS that gets the signal from the satellites. So you're driving, you're trying to navigate, you're coming down the road. Next slide. You run into all kind of obstacles, down power lines. These are all de-energized. But till you run over a power cable, you see them up on the pole, but you don't realize how fat they are and how thick they are till you run over one in your car. Of course, they're de-energized, but still, it's like a mini speed bump when you run over that power cable as you're driving around. Next slide. I'll tell you, go back one. Can you go back one? Interesting. Like any place, you have the high-income neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods. All throughout the island, you see these bars on the windows. Well, don't let that fool you. That may be a high-income neighborhood. It's the culture. So whether you're in Puerto Rico or you're in Mexico, everybody's got bars on their windows. They have a nice neighborhood, which you would consider the rich people neighborhood, the mayor's neighborhood. They all got bars on their windows. They have fences around their house, individual compound. It's their culture. They build a moat around their house, with fences, and they have bars on the window. You're like, is this a high crime neighborhood? No, it's just the way they are, the way their culture is. Everybody's got bars on their windows. And it was like, I kept thinking I was in a low income neighborhood or a crime ridden neighborhood. And no, that's not necessarily the case. It's just everybody down there, and in most of the Mexican, the country of Mexico, a lot of the Caribbean islands, that's their culture. They're protecting their turf by building a fence around their house or putting bars on their windows. So it's interesting to get used to when you deploy to an area like this. Next slide. This was the Guacataca Dam. You can see the breach and the spillway. Next slide. More water coming through. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was on site along with the Puerto Rico officials trying to ascertain would the dam burst, and they would have to get notices out to everybody downstream to evacuate. Of course, the radio and television stations are off the air. They can't use the emergency broadcast system, so they had other arrangements to fly helicopters with loudspeakers to try to tell people to evacuate. Fortunately, it never got to that point, but it was a very real possibility that the dam was going to breach. Fortunately, it didn't, but we had ham radio operators there with the Corps of Engineers relaying information back to the EOC about the status of the dam. Next slide. All of the USARs, the urban search and rescue teams, were down in Puerto Rico. You had all kind of volunteers and responders. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry federal agency was there. So you had Department of Homeland Security, you had FEMA, you had the U.S. Forest Service from Boise, Idaho, and their cache of radio equipment. all of the USARs, there's one here in Fairfax County. I think they were down there all around the United States. The New York Fire Department, the Chicago Fire Department were on scene. You're like, why are you bringing in firefighters from the city of New York to Puerto Rico? There's no fires to fight. What they were doing, they were going around and assessing the Puerto Rico fire departments, the bomberos, and making a report. What is the status of these fire stations? Are they totally destroyed? Are they partially damaged? Are they operational? What equipment do they need? So you got to realize that the regular Puerto Rico firemen, they got affected. So they're trying to take care of their family and their house. So you brought in outside aid from the New York Fire Department, Chicago Fire Department to come around and do these damage assessments and surveys to make a report of what needs to be done to bring the Puerto Rico Fire Department and the fire stations up to snuff to get them back in operations. And again, some of the aid from outside world being distributed out to the fire departments. It's very interesting, the culture down there. When aid came in and you're distributing it out island-wide, the mayor runs his little fiefdom, his little municipality. He would try to come up and say, give me the aid, I will make sure and distribute it. But the relief workers were told, no, make sure the aid goes directly to the people. Because if the mayor got his hands on the stuff, he would take his cut and give it to his cronies, you know. So whenever outside aid came to the municipalities around the island, the people would try to get it distributed directly to the citizens rather than letting it go through a mayor or a politician or somebody to prevent the misappropriation of relief efforts. Next slide. People lined up getting water. This coming down out of this side of this mountain is a potable water faucet or outlet. This big blue container is storing that water, and people would come up with jugs and water vessels or whatever type they had to try to get water to take back to their houses. Next slide. Like I say, you're driving down the road, you're trying to get out to an area, and you have erosion, landslides, boulders, whatever. And you know, you're not from Puerto Rico, you don't know the area, and you're depending on your GPS, so you come to a roadblock and you have to turn around and let it recalculate and take a different route to get where you're going. Next slide. Interesting, this is a grocery shopping cart without the wheels, and you see the bridges out, and they had a jury-rigged pulley system to fill up this grocery cart with supplies and send it back and forth across the bridge outage there. Next slide. More damaged houses. Next slide.
Or communications tower.
Yeah, one of the few that were standing. Next slide. The gas stations, Puerto Rico adopted the metric system. So when you do come up to a gas station that still has a sign, the sign here is missing, they had the prices, everything is in liters. So, you know, you're used to seeing price per gallon here in the mainland. In Puerto Rico, everything is priced per liter for fuel. Next slide. Some of the areas, the roads were so damaged that you had to hike in. So these are relief workers coming in to survey the people and check and see what help they needed. You couldn't get a car through, so they're having to park and then hike in to get to the neighborhoods. Next slide. This was some of the task force, the fire department. We did have some of our amateur radio operators embedded with the bomberos, the local Puerto Rico fire department officials. Next slide. Again, you would see water, drinkable water, people filling up with soft drink bottles, milk cans, milk jugs, whatever, to try to get water. Next slide. Power. Power was out everywhere. This is a big high voltage power line, the backbone around the island. A lot of these towers were over on the ground or at a 45-degree angle. They brought in help from the United States to try to get these up, but you couldn't get power restored to the neighborhoods until you got the high voltage lines up around the island distribution system. So a lot of outside workers came in to help restore power. Next slide. This was right next to the convention center. These are the Marine One helicopters in preparation for the president's visit. They brought these in on a big C5 Galaxy, I think it was, cargo aircraft, and they were flying around the island. This was like a couple days before the president's visit. They shipped these down and test them out. So when the president does come down, and he lands, they have a helicopter they've tested out that's able to take him for a helicopter tour of the island. Next slide. Here you can see some of the helicopters and the Ospreys and different aircraft on the airport next to the convention center. The interesting here, this is the parking area of the San Juan Convention Center, and this is a covered parking area, and these are all solar panels. So when they built the convention center, they were trying to incorporate solar panels into the operation of the convention center. Next slide. Just some of the helicopters flying around outside of San Juan. You have all these big hotels, the Hilton, the Marriott, the Sheraton, no commercial power. They rent your room, but not guaranteed of any power or air conditioning. Next slide. Again, here's like the signs usually indicate the prices and price per liter. Just a shot of the local gas station. When we first arrived, there were long lines, about a mile long, to get gas. We had a FEMA ID credential that would allow us as first responders to jump to the front of the line. And the people didn't mind because they knew you were there to help out. But everything was cash based. The little satellite dishes that sit on top of the gas station, that when you zip your credit card and it goes through satellite to validate, those were all blown over and non-functioning. So everything was cash based at the gas station, and they had armed personnel at the gas station, because of the amount of cash that were there. And you were also limited to so much gasoline per purchase per vehicle. And like I say, if you were way at the end of the line, it maybe run out by the time you got there. Gas was in very short supply the first week after the hurricane. After that, the gas supply sort of got better, and it was not as much lines around the island. Next slide. If you were able to open, you were able to make money. So we're out tooling around San Juan, and everything's black, lights out, and all of a sudden you come up on a Whopper, and we're like, we're tired of rice and beans. Here's a Burger King open. We're going to have a Whopper. Next slide. Here's the Whopper menu inside. So you may not be able to read Spanish, but you can pick out the picture and say, I want a number 1 or number 6, whatever. So, and even though most all the young people, the people that worked in service industry, they were bilingual and spoke both Spanish and English. So most of the people working the counter at Burger King or other restaurants were able to speak English, so you could go up and order, no problem at all. Next slide. This was out toward Arecibo. This was one of the engineers from Arecibo Observatory. His day job was a engineer at Arecibo, but he's also a ham radio operator. And this was his tower that was well guided and survived. He had some elements up here damaged on his tower, but his ham radio tower survived the storm. Next slide. That was his vehicle that had the Arecibo logos on the side of his car doors there. Next slide. And you got to get used to all the stop signs in Spanish. Next slide. A shot of the outside of a fire department. Next slide. So here's a fire department, and here's a guy. They have a fire hydrant open, running the hose out. He's out here in the background with water containers in the back of his pickup truck, and so he's juicing up his water barrels from the fire hydrant there. I think this was in Ponce that they were able to get water out of the fire hydrant and fill up the water containers. Next slide. This was going into Larry's to provide aid. Just a shot of the sign outside the town. Next slide. You see the erosion and some of the buildings tumbling down. Next slide. Puerto Rico was nice and warm, 75, 80 degrees, but it's a tropical rainforest, and it rains every afternoon. So this is a shot looking outside of the Puerto Rico Convention Center at the like clockwork afternoon storms that always roll up. Next slide. This was the governor's podium at his area of the EOC. So the governor would come out and address the citizens of Puerto Rico from the EOC. Next slide. In the FEMA Hilton, you saw a slide earlier, they provided us some cots and linen, and when everybody checked out, you would stack your linen up and they would send that off site to get it laundered. Next slide. This was inside the transportation desk, ESF-1 at the EOC. So their boss was there. He said that he had military flights, helicopters around the island. He didn't want his pilots sitting around. If you needed a flight to do a mission, he was ready to fly you. So if you had a mission to go on the island somewhere and you needed to go by air, the air boss would get you fixed up. Next slide. You can actually get mail. So here was the mail address, FEMA employee's name, care of the convention center in San Juan. And the United States Postal Service had a representative there in the EOC. Next slide. Showed you earlier that they had, if you were out on the island, you had to do your laundry and shower, personal hygiene in a 5-gallon bucket. This is the back of the Puerto Rico Convention Center, and this is U.S. military. It's set up. These are water bladders, and these are shower tents. They had a male and female shower tent. So no heat in the water, but if you took a shower at 5 a.m., it was kind of a cool shower. If you took a shower at 2 p.m., it was a nice warm shower. It depended on the air temperature outside. But if you were in the FEMA Hilton inside the EOC, or you were assigned to the EOC, you did have a way to get a shower that you didn't have to, soap up with a 5-gallon bucket. Next slide. They did have a commercial laundry. This is a military trailer, and they had these commercial washing machines. So you would take your laundry, they would give you a mesh bag, and they would seal it up, and they'd throw your dirty underwear in with everybody else's dirty underwear into the big commercial laundry, and 72 hours later, you get your laundry back if they'd washed it and folded it and returned it to you, free of charge. But that's a military unit was assigned to the EOC to provide that service. Next slide. Right next to the Puerto Rico Convention Center was the Sheraton Hotel and Casino. They were running on generator power until they got commercial power back. Once they got commercial power back in San Juan, they were running that casino 24/7, gambling, slot machines, roulette, all kind of gambling, drinks, floor shows. The gambling goes on, people having a good time across the island. People have no power, no water, no food. It's a classic case of the haves and the have-nots. But, Sheraton's there to make money, and my God, they were making money with the casino. Next slide. More damage around the island. Next slide. NOAA. This was the NOAA NEXRAD weather radar. And you can see the ball is gone. And so our weather view of the island, we had no local radar on the island for weather. You had to depend on space-based satellite radar to know what the storm front was and the weather coming in, because the local land-based radars were destroyed. Next slide. Another close-up picture of the weather radar there. Next slide. Generators. Most of the Caribbean islands, including Puerto Rico, always suffer tropical storm, hurricane every now and then. So they have generators, but mostly their generators are used for 2-3 day period, and then commercial power comes back on. Commercial power was not coming back on, and is still not back on in parts of Puerto Rico. So they were running generators 24/7 nonstop, and a lot of these generators, without maintenance, without fuel filters, oil filters, some maintenance and repair, they're conking out. So it was just, if you had a generator, most people in the residential areas, you would get up in the morning, run your generator, do your morning routine, cook breakfast, maybe run a load of laundry at your house, and then you would shut your generator down, and you wouldn't turn it back on until maybe supper time, do your evening activities with the generator, and then you would cut it off and go to bed. And you did that to prolong the life of your generator, because if you had a generator, you were fortunate, because a lot of your neighbors didn't. Next slide. More damage. Next slide. Like I say, you're driving down the road, and here's power line. This is a concrete power pole. There were the traditional wooden power poles, a lot of the concrete power poles, but they were down like dominoes. You're driving down the road, it's just dominoes. And once one gets pulled down, they're all connected by wires, it would pull all of them down. So there were a lot of work to get the power restored and clear the roadways of these power line obstructions. Next slide. Again, power in the city there. Next slide. More damage, more obstructions in the road. Next slide. The Puerto Rico National Guard was out around the island, water buffaloes trying to distribute food and water around the island. They had B&W antennas and HF radio at many of the National Guard armories around Puerto Rico, but a lot of them got blown down, and as I alluded to earlier, they're not very adept at HF radio. Everything is satellite now in the military, and they just couldn't figure out how to put up an HF antenna. But we, the amateur radio community, helped them out and helped restore HF communications to some of the armories. Next slide. More damage. Next slide. Yeah, just a lot of damage shots here. Next slide. Next slide. And you see this was a paved road, but it's full of dirt and mud from the erosion after the slide, so cars were unable to get through. If you're able to walk down to a food distribution center, a pod, a point of distribution, and get your food, bring it back up, you usually have to walk in and out. Next slide.
All right.
Just if you've been to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Cuba got a lot in common, a lot of older vehicles there. Next slide. Again, some of the power lines, communications lines down around the island. Next slide. More damage, warehouse area. Next slide. And then just, like I say, this just kind of give you an idea of the damage around the island. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And like I say, some of the power poles down. Next slide. More power poles down. And when I left, they had power back in San Juan and a few other places. Even though this is February of 2018, the hurricane hit in September of 2017, there are still pockets of Puerto Rico that still do not have commercial power. Next slide. Just some of the shots as the relief teams are going out to provide aid, communications, family reunification efforts. Next slide. Next slide. You just see they got whacked pretty hard down there. Next slide. A lot of tarps over roofs trying to keep the rain out. Next slide. These were the gas lines. You can see they were pretty long down the road, and it would take you most of the day to get from back here to up here to get to the gas station. And at any time you could get bumped by Puerto Rico State Police or Red Cross vehicle or whoever, jump to the front of the line to get gassed up to go out and provide services. Next slide. More damage. Next slide. Mall area. You see the Burger King and the different logos, AT&T. Next slide. And like I alluded to earlier, farm animals, wild cats, dogs, sheep, pigs, horses. The fences were down. The barn that they lived in was blown away. So they're just sort of roaming around the island. Next slide. More damage again. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Shot of the bomberos, the Puerto Rico Fire Department. Next slide. So you're driving down the road and you've got power lines hanging down, trees hanging down. So you may reach a point that you have to make a U-turn and head back out, and you have to depend, you don't know the area, you don't have a Puerto Rico road map, you're depending on your GPS. So you have to drive around and let your GPS recalculate so you can take a different route to get where you're going. Next slide. Down in Mount Wes. Next slide. Again, more power lines down. Next slide. Road closed, and you see the mile markers in kilometers. Everything is in kilometers down in Puerto Rico. So you'll be driving down the road. You think you're trying to get back here. You don't have very far to go, but now you got to turn around and go back.
Was that 3.4 kilometers?
Yeah. And you'd see the boulders and the erosion, the hills sloughing off, coming down into the road. Next slide. Again, the "We will rise again" signs. You saw quite a bit of these around the island. Next slide. Power workers coming in to help restore the big power lines. Next slide. Some of the hilltops, a lot of communications. This one doesn't have any in it, but most of the communications towers, cell towers, public safety communications on top of the hills up here. Next slide. Driving down the road, and the road is not there anymore. Saw a lot of this in different areas. Next slide. And we're back to the beginning of the history. So now if we swap back to the PowerPoint. Next slide, come down. So we spent 3 weeks there. I spent 27 days there. Here are some of the things we accomplished. Original mission was recruited by the ARRL to support the Red Cross to do amateur radio. Once we got there, the mission was changed to do A to Z communications, MacGyver, jury rig, whatever. Here are some of the functions we did. So we supported as many different agencies as we could by doing different things around the island. So yes, we did amateur radio operations. We helped out as best we could, but the people of Puerto Rico got whacked very hard. They're going to have a long road to recovery down there. And even though a lot of the island infrastructure is back up and running, they've got a long way to go. Next slide. Here is the force of 22 of the hams and their call signs that deployed down there. I'll give you a minute to look at that. You may recognize a call sign or two from some of your contesting or Hamfest or whatever. But these 22 hams, like I say, the oldest one was 75, the youngest one was 19, and they came from all parts of the United States. So from Oregon to Florida to New York to Oklahoma and all areas in between, we were from all parts of the United States. And next slide. And that is it. If I can answer any questions about our ARRL force of 50, which was actually 22, deployment to Puerto Rico, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
What happened to the radios that were donated?
That's why they sent Mike Corey down from ARRL headquarters.
To try to find them?
Well, to Mike, if you're watching, to keep an eye on them. The ARRL had assembled all of these ham aid kits, go kits, from donations of amateur radio operators to the ARRL ham aid fund. And with this particular hurricane, they had asked for corporate donations. So the ARRL wanted to make sure they got their equipment back. So we had the radios drop shipped into Atlanta. We checked them all out. We took them to Puerto Rico. We had been there about a week or so before Mike Curry, the ARRL's national emergency manager guy, showed up. And he was there not to necessarily direct any hams because we're under the auspices of the Red Cross, not the ARRL. But he was there just to keep an eye on the equipment and make sure it gets back. So when our deployment was over, a lot of the Pelican cases of the radios got shipped back to Newington, Connecticut. We did leave a few behind under the watchful eye of the Puerto Rico section manager. So several of the kits did stay behind, but most of them got shipped back to ARRL headquarters.
How'd you work out with the Red Cross?
That was interesting. I had been to several deployments in years past. Most notably was Katrina back in 2005. I had worked with the Red Cross, but not for the Red Cross. So at Katrina, we assisted the Red Cross, but we didn't report to them. And in this operation, we were under the Red Cross control because the ARRL had recruited us, and we're actually working under the direct supervision of the Red Cross. It worked very good. A lot of the hams are used to doing stuff their way, the ham way, and of course you've got the Red Cross leadership and bureaucracy, and you have to follow within their bureaucracy and how they do things. So once you got sort of used to that, you salute smartly and say, yes sir, I will carry out your mission.
Did the Red Cross management understand how to work with and utilize what you were providing?
At first, like I say, the original mission was to support the Red Cross only. After we got there and assessed the situation, the ARRL section manager, we would have daily meetings with the Red Cross leadership, and we explained to them that we could do so much more than our original amateur radio mission. And with the blessing of the Red Cross, they modified our mission to continue to support Red Cross, but to also provide help outside of the original mission. So they were very open to that at the local level there in Puerto Rico.
What was the pace of activity of the net control stations? I mean, they were open 24/7, but were they busy the whole time, or was it?
Initially, our initial deployment was 3 weeks long. The first week there, it was a lot of activity because we got there about a week after the hurricane hit. And at that time, outside aid is coming in. There's no communications statewide to the Puerto Rico State Police, the hospitals, the fire departments. They did get the PSAP, the Public Safety Answering Point, up and running. They have one PSAP island-wide. So if you were able to call 911, this is 911, what is your emergency? My house is on fire. Well, that's great. We'll make a record of it here in the computer. Your house is on fire. However, we can't talk to the Puerto Rico Fire Department across the island because all of the VHF communications links are down. So yes, we can take your 911 call, but we can't provide you any 911 aid. So as relief efforts are getting in, there's a lot of activity the first week or two. By the end of our deployment, a lot more aid is coming in, a lot more communications is being restored. So initially the amateur radio activity is high. The further away from the impact, the day the hurricane made the impact, the further you get away from that, more communications is coming up and the need for amateur radio is going down because other systems are coming back up online. The Puerto Rico State Police on the 800 megahertz system, they had several microwave links to link it together. The military was able to get some of the microwave dishes realigned and provide communications. AT&T, all the different telecom providers were able to go in and splice cables, the fiber optic ring around the island that had been severed because bridges had gone out of place and severed the fiber optic cable, stuff like that. So initially, amateur radio or HF communications, NVIS communications was basically the way you talk from one end of the island to the other. But the longer we were there, repeaters were coming back up, both public safety repeaters, amateur repeaters, and so more and more communications coming back up online.
So it started as HF and moved toward VHF.
Yeah. And HF was very, very good. We were talking to the U.S. Virgin Islands, all across Puerto Rico, but as more and more repeaters were coming up online, a lot more vehicles had VHF and UHF installed in the vehicles, or you had a handheld that you could hit with a repeater. So it was much easier to use a handheld or a mobile radio to communicate around the island via the repeaters. We did get a new repeater installed at El Yunque National Forest. It's Oscar, the section manager, is now the trustee of that, but that was a government repeater that they donated for amateur radio use for the relief effort. So we coordinated that installation up at El Yunque National Forest. Any other questions?
What's the process for getting selected to be a volunteer on this?
How quick you were to dial up the number. When the American Red Cross contacted the ARRL to solicit amateur radio operators on behalf of the Red Cross, ARRL blasted out an email. They put it on their website. Some hams saw that, started talking on their nets around the United States, and they got over 350 responses, but they kind of looked through it and they tried to say, well, you have a CPAP, or you have a defibrillator implanted into you, or you're a diabetic or whatever. So they had all this big response. They're trying to go through and make sure you didn't have a medical condition. Were you in physical shape? Could you actually just deploy to an austere environment and be able to function without help, and they were looking at skill set. How long have you been a ham? Have you done this kind of stuff before? So that was sort of the selection criteria. But a lot of it was how quick you picked up the phone and called ARRL headquarters and says, I'm here, I can volunteer. So once they got that list, they tried to call the list down to make sure they had the right skill set. We as a group, a lot of the amateur radio operators are type A personality. I'm in charge, I'm gonna do it, So you get 20-something people that are all that same personality. You got to figure out, well, who's going to be in charge, So yes, we report to the Red Cross, but within our group, who's going to be the head wrangler? So you have to sort of look and talk to people and figure out who's got the best, personality for sort of managing the amateur radio group, internally. So we kind of went through that process and selected a leader inside. The section manager selected myself, Valerie, and Joe to be his sort of leaders of the group. So Joe was the net control over at Red Cross at Telemundo, and Valerie and I were over at the EOC. So we would always, the three of us would meet every morning with Oscar and attend the ESF2 meeting, but we had our ducks in a row as far as amateur radio, what we were doing to support the Red Cross and to support the others right now. Yes, sir.
How many of the go kits were there?
I think there were 20, and we had 22 people. DX Engineering had funded a lot of the equipment at the last minute. So once the ARRL got the request to do the MOU between the ARRL and the Red Cross, they had a couple of go kits, ham-made kits there at ARRL, but they needed some more. So they reached out to DX Engineering and some other amateur radio equipment manufacturers that opened their pocketbooks and helped fund and get these kits down there. And that's why the ARRL is very concerned about, with their go kits, make it back to Connecticut.
What do you think
We'll see how many end up at Hamfest.
What do you think the value of a kit was?
Whatever the value of an ICOM 7200 and the MFJ power supply and the tuner and
Yeah, but the kit and everything else, like 10K?
yeah, maybe about $10,000, I guess. Eight to 10,000.
Would there have been anybody to just give these things to, give them away?
We did leave some behind for the Puerto Rico section manager that his section emergency coordinator could use. And in addition to the go kits, the ARRL had the donation of some of these little, you've seen the little Honda generators, the 1 kW generators. Several of those got sent down the island. We sent a couple of those up to the mountains of Puerto Rico to where the Puerto Rico SEC section emergency coordinator lived, and he was able to use one of those generators to get his house for his personal family back on the air, but he also had a repeater there at his house, and we were able to use that little generator to power him up. So all in all, it was a interesting deployment, a lot of lessons learned, but here in the United States, you hear the term prepper, and the people that are trying to live off the grid or be able to live off the grid should something happen. Yeah, some people ridicule them, some people embrace them, but it's not a bad mindset to be in. You get down to Puerto Rico where when you have a storm the magnitude of Hurricane Maria and you have loss of all commercial power, all commercial telecommunications, radio, television, you got amateur radio. That's really the only game in town. The police, they use communications every day, the public safety, the federal agencies, the U.S. Marshal Service, they use radios every day, but they don't know how to go out and throw wires up in trees and make things work. The hams do, So.
Did you get to do a lot of training in that way to sort of extend your influence? When you say talking about people not being able to put up a dipole, could you bring people along with you so that they can go and do the next one?
We did. We tried to talk to the military, and the military was very interested. A lot of the enlisted people, the officers would come by and they go, that's good. Sergeant, take notes, So we did work with the military to sort of train them that, years ago, y'all used to do this kind of stuff, but they've gotten away with it. The different military specialties now, it's all satellite and IP based and this, that, and the other. So they're looking for Pelican cases full of routers and, Cat5 cable and this, that, and the other. And no, we don't use any of that stuff. You just need a battery and a radio and antenna and you're working, What about encryption? Well, I'm not really worried about encryption, We're talking from one end of the island to the other. This is not NSA Type 1 encryption and national security. We're trying to say they need water and food on the other end of the island. I don't care who's listening. Can we get the message from point A to point B? Well, you don't need encryption. All you need is this.
So they learned some hard lessons and maybe they'll change their plans on their training.
Well, you would think so. We had a lot of lessons we learned after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And you take notes, and we're going to do better next time, and then you get complacent and a lot of things. They say the best laid plans of mice and men, So you got all these plans, and you try to adjust for the next time, but sometimes you do, and sometimes it falls through the crack. But Puerto Rico was interesting because of the isolation of the island and the inability to get aid from the outside world there very quickly. Whereas Katrina, yes, it was bad, but you could drive right to it and bring food supplies. So I'd like to go back to Puerto Rico in maybe 5 years, visit the place, see how they're coming in recovery, but it's going to be a long time. A lot of the younger people,
They all speak English. They're United States citizens. They don't need a passport. All they got to do is buy a ticket, fly out of San Juan into the United States. They got relatives, friends. There's no jobs in Puerto Rico because the power's out, school's out. They're all milling around in the streets. If there was a bar opening, there was people all at the bar drinking beer. What are you gonna do? There's no power, there's no water, nothing to do but drink and socialize. You know, there's no school, there's no work. The factories aren't working. You're just standing around, you know. Some of the people were trying to help themselves and help their fellow citizens, and others were like, gimme, 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 you know, what can you do for me? And others were trying to take care of themselves and take care of others. So you had a mixture of that type of response down there. But they're in a different culture. That yes, they're part of the United States, United States territory, but due to their history and heritage, they have a different outlook on stuff. What do they say on island time? So we would have a meeting, 0900, we're going to start the meeting, and you know, we need you there to report on what you've done for the previous 24 hours and what you've done to restore communications. And didn't the meeting start at 9 o'clock? It's 9:25. You know,
Manana.
Yeah.
That's called DC time.
What bands were most effective communicating across the island?
What's that?
What bands?
Initially, due to the different communications were out, it was HF. But once communications was back up and running, VHF was the next predominant means of communication.
What I meant was in HF, what frequencies were most effective getting across the island?
We were using 40 meters to communicate mostly around the island.
Did you use NVIS antennas?
Yes, yes.
Because that's what the military would normally use.
Yeah.
Used to use.
Yeah.
They still do.
Yes, sir.
How did you find the attitude of the FEMA people? Pretty much, you know, because I've encountered, I've worked for the government for over 50 years now, and occasionally I'll find government people who, particularly military, who will work till the job is done. The other group will work until 5 o'clock, and they will absolutely not work a minute without being paid for it.
Well, you remember your...
Did you find that kind of attitude with the FEMA people, or were they more decent citizens trying to solve the problem?
Well, you remember your high school chemistry class, and you had that periodic table of elements on the wall, and that one little element down there in the bottom corner, governmentium, can never be created nor destroyed.
Yep.
So yes, you ran into governmentium on the periodic table. Most of the FEMA forward deployed people in Puerto Rico was very nice. They working 12, 16 hours a day trying to make sure that the mission was accomplished, but they had to answer to people back in DC. Sure. When we first got there, we were 22 out of the original 50 that were selected to go. And we realized the magnitude of what needed to be done. We were trying to get amateur radio people, additional hams deployed, but JetBlue had donated the original flight. So we were trying to coordinate with FEMA to get them to bring additional amateur radios down on a FEMA flight. The pencil pushers back in DC are hemming and hawing and trying to make a decision. A lot of the different equipment, we needed some, we had frequency coordinators from both NTIA and FCC, and they were saying, you know, we've got the frequencies coordinated, but we can use some more gear. The guys in DC are still trying to put the pencil to it, figure out, can we do it? And by the time they get it figured out, it's too late. You know, we could have used it at the very beginning, but 3 weeks later, you've already got something else to work in its place.
All the FEMA people paid overtime for every hour?
They were all salaried FEMA employees, most of them, except for I think some of the people in the MERS units. But I'm not sure, you know, most of them where I worked in the EOC were like GS 12, 13, 14, stuff like that. There were a couple of GS 15s there. A lot of the,
being paid.
yeah, I don't know if they get paid overtime or
They get
whatever.
paid overtime. They won't work a minute overtime, most of them.
Well, like I say, most of the forward deployed FEMA people were doing what it took to get the job done.
Yeah.
But the information I got coming back from the people at the rear echelon, they were doing the typical, it's 5 o'clock, I gotta go home.
Yeah, because they weren't getting paid.
Was Valerie the only woman?
Yes, Valerie was very nice. She was my bunkmate, and I had a snorer on one side and Valerie on the other side, you know, lined up on the cots. And Valerie slept very good. I slept very good, and the guy on the other side of me was like snoring all night long. But Valerie was there, did a very good job. She and I were assigned to the EOC, so I was liaison. Valerie did most of the paperwork and report writing. And if you know Valerie, she's got her own amateur radio blog and video channels and stuff on YouTube and stuff. So she was very good about getting the word out and stuff. In fact, one of the things that Valerie did, I think there was 78 hospitals across the island, and it turned out that only 52 of them were operational, physically operational, you know, were intact and able to operate. So we had to figure out which of the 52 hospitals had communications, and you know, was it a hospital radio, was it a telephone or whatever. So we got a list of the 52 hospitals, and Valerie just picked up her cell phone, started dialing. She got an answer, check, you have communications, you have a phone line. You know, if they didn't answer, we would send a runner out to the hospital to see, you know, what the status of it was. But by Valerie just using her initiative and going down the phone list and calling the hospitals, about 50% of them we found still had a working phone line. You know, but nobody asked Valerie to do that. She just did it on her own initiative.
So
Yes,
I've
sir.
got a question a little bit down the weeds. In the time, when you set up there and when you started getting going, rather than the later part where a lot of aid had been pouring in and starting to getting organized, what was like the volume of messages that you had going through your command posts?
Well, we had two different types of messages. We had messages that were internal to the Red Cross. So you would do a day trip from the Red Cross headquarters in San Juan to various cities and municipalities around the island. So they would leave in a Red Cross rented vehicle. We had mobile radios we installed and plugged in a cigarette lighter in the vehicles and went out, and that type of communication messages were Red Cross centric about what they needed to do the Red Cross mission. We would encounter a mayor that says, you know, I need food, water, whatever, and those messages we'd relay back to the EOC. So they'd come into our desk where Valerie and I were working, and they need food, they need water, they need medical supplies. What was that ESF2 chart? ESF2 is what, number 8? Where is ESF8 desk here in the EOC? So initially we had to trot around and find stuff. So we went to the FEMA ops people and we told them what we were doing, and we were getting messages in via amateur radio. And we had email inside the EOC, we had power in the EOC, we had the military had DOD teleports set up. So we had robust communications. You could surf the web, look at video, whatever. So we had internal, intra-EOC communications. So when we got messages in via amateur radio that they needed food, water, medical, whatever, power, they're all going to different ESF functions. And rather than us trotting around the EOC trying to find that ESF desk for power or medical or water, we talked to FEMA Ops, and they gave us an email address to send all of our traffic to. And then they would farm it out to the appropriate person to provide the relief. So we went from us trotting around the EOC initially to being able to send it to FEMA Ops for them to take action on rather than us. But we were the conduit to bring the traffic in from the outside world into the EOC to say they need medical supplies, they need bandages, they need cots or water or whatever. And that's the way we started handling after that.
Okay, so another down the weeds question. So you're sitting, this has happened to me, so I'm trying to just relate a little. You're sitting in front of a radio, you got a net out there, somebody out in the field is working with the team, they're saying, where is the generators we asked for at 2 o'clock? We've got to get these generators up because we've got another thing going on, they name it, it's important. You remember somewhere in the distant past that you handled a message saying generators were critically needed. And now another one comes in. What do?
We kept a log of all of our radio traffic, but your standard answer was the checks in the mail. Once we took a message in and we passed it to FEMA Ops to take action on, we had a record in our logbook of the radio traffic received, and we relayed it to the appropriate authority. But we had no mechanism to go to FEMA Ops and follow up on it. I mean, it's into the governmentium bureaucracy world. Now, we would be happy to generate a duplicate message for whatever the original request was, and they would see it, and they could maybe match them up or take action on it. We had no way, once the message came into the EOC and we relayed it to FEMA Ops, we had no way to, somebody called back, what's the ETA on those supplies? Heck if I know.
Would it
Checks in
have
the
been
mail.
useful in a situation like that, since you were logging the traffic, would it have been useful to match it up and say, this is the second, this is the third?
Not really, because once we delivered it to FEMA, they had their own little online, they would take our little paragraph that we had of what was needed in amateur radio speak, and they would type it in the FEMA computer system that has all these blocks, and the two don't match up.
Okay, so those are the guys that were responsible for tracking requests and making sure they were acted on.
Right. They were tracked in the FEMA request system, but we didn't have access to that FEMA tracking system. So if somebody was calling back about yesterday we requested this aid and we hadn't seen it, what's the status of it? Checks in the mail, I don't know. I'll be happy to duplicate it and pass it up again. That's the best we could do. But I think we did make a difference down there, but there was just so much to do. I mean, the people of Puerto Rico, they got hit hard down there.
They can put out little teams like yourselves.
FEMA has, you have regular FEMA government employees, you have AmeriCorps, the FEMA jobs program for young people. You saw a lot of those down there. They have what they call FEMA reservist. So if you're say you're a telecom guy or whatever, and you're 50, 60, 65, retired, but you still want to help out your fellow citizens, you can register with FEMA Corps online, let them know that I'm an experienced telecom guy, I can do this, this, and this. All my shots are up to date, I got a passport, I can deploy. FEMA puts you in the database. Whenever they have a disaster, earthquake, hurricane, flood, whatever, in addition to their normal federal government employees, active employees, they dip into the FEMA Corps database and they select certain people to deploy.
How many people do you think FEMA pushed into Puerto Rico?
A whole lot, and like I said earlier, every Tom, Dick, and Harry federal agency was down there. U.S. Marshal Service, U.S. Forestry Service, FEMA, DHS, all of the state agencies. Not only do you have
Would you get several thousand?
Yes, in the multiple thousands. You've got the federal government to state aid, and then you have state aid to state aid. So not only was the federal government supplying aid to Puerto Rico from federal to state, other states were providing state to state aid, even though Puerto Rico is a territory. So. Any other questions? Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I hope
Thank you for all the information.
I hope you got a
Yes,
feel for
thank you.
what Puerto Rico went through.